Hello and welcome to My Career in Data, a podcast where we discuss with industry leaders and experts how they have built their careers. I'm your host, Shannon Kemp, and today we're talking to Peter van Jaarsveld from Oliver.
With a robust catalog of courses offered on demand and industry-leading live online sessions throughout the year, the DATAVERSITY Training Center is your launchpad for career success. Browse the complete catalog at training.dataversity.net and use code DVTalks for 20% off your purchase.
Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Officer at DATAVERSITY, and this is My Career in Data, a DATAVERSITY Talks podcast dedicated to learning from those who have careers in data management, to understand how they got there, and to be talking with people who help make those careers a little bit easier. To keep up to date in the latest in data management education, go to dataversity.net/subscribe. Today, we are joined by Peter van Jaarsveld, the Global Head of Production at Oliver. And normally, this is where a podcast host would read a short bio of the guest. But in this podcast, your bio is what we're here to talk about. Peter, hello and welcome.
Thank you so much. Very nice to be here.
Oh, so glad you could join us. So tell me, you're the Global Head of Production at Oliver. So let's start with Oliver. What kind of business is Oliver?
So we're an advertising agency, but with a slight twist in that we focus on in-housing. So we build agencies inside our clients' businesses all over the world. And that's been our business model for the better part of the last 14 years. So ad agencies as you know them, but from the inside.
Oh, very nice. So as the global head of production, what is it you do for Oliver? What's your typical work week look like?
So it's, I suppose, no 2 weeks are ever alike, I suppose, like anybody in this business. But, my focus is very much on the content we create, but both the quality of it as well as the effectiveness. And the focus in recent years has shifted very much from efficiency to effectiveness. So creating, content that performs, in a marketing context. So, my average week, a lot of my time is spent with clients on solutioning, on solution design. Gen AI and AI over the last couple of months has really changed the nature of how we work. And there's a lot of time spent with our clients on understanding how that impacts them, their work, and where this will take them. So that's a big focus at the moment. And then the other side of that is working with the rest of the organization to make sure as a business, we're ready for what really is a transformative change in how we do the work that we do.
Oh, that's very cool. So how is generative AI changing things for you?
Well, it's a very interesting topic in that, we've been working with generative AI as far back as 2015, 2016. We started our first kind of client pilots back in 2018. But obviously in the last year or so since ChatGPT, really kind of captured the public's attention, that's just completely supercharged the focus on that. And, we generally, when we start working with clients to understand AI and Gen AI, the focus immediately shifts towards efficiency. The assumption, and not wrongly, is that AI will make us more efficient, and it will absolutely, and it is making us more efficient. But, a lot of the work we do is focused on what can we do? What do we do with that efficiency? Because if you think of it, through a marketing lens, marketing is all about differentiation. It's all about helping our customers stand out, and achieve their goals. So if the efficiency benefits of AI kind of represents table stakes to some degree, everybody becomes more efficient. Then the question is, what do we do with that headroom? So a lot of our work is focused on how do we unlock, additional value? How do we find new things to do with that headroom? And that could be personalization, it could be more volume, it could be new markets. So, for us, it's very much about understanding how can we, I suppose, work on both sides of that coin. The other side of that, I suppose, is how do we do it safely and ethically? We're slowly starting to see the green shoots of governance, come through in the EU and in the US and in other places, but there's no, consistent global governance framework yet. So a lot of our work is also focused on understanding how can we best advise our clients and, set up our business to use Gen AI safely, ethically, and, in a way that will be sustainable as, governance does increase.
I'm so glad you mix in ethics with that in that mix. It's become such a hot topic along with generative AI, right? Like you say, the security and the ethics of what you should and shouldn't put in and how to use it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's so interesting. We've had the most interesting sort of case studies where just because you can do something with AI, should you do it? Things like when you start generating virtual humans, should we be generating virtual humans? From a visual perspective, when we, create chatbots that are now becoming almost indistinguishable from, at least a chat conversation. Do we need to disclose? Should we disclose that, the consumer is interacting with AI? Now, the EU governance, guidelines, disclosure is a big part of that. So, that will, I think, become probably a legal requirement in most territories. But, at the moment, it's about advising our clients and working with them to say, as a brand, whatever you do, you want to make sure that you don't, regret later on. Yeah, so it's a very interesting kind of space from that perspective right now. And I suppose we don't talk about it that much. We focus a lot on the technology, but not as much on the ethics and the change management.
Very nice. So let's back it up then a little bit here before we get too much more into what you're currently doing. So tell me, Oliver, when you were, say, like 6 years old, was this the dream? Did you say, I'm going to be the global head of production at Oliver when I grow up? What was
Isn't
the
that the
dream?
coolest? No, I mean it's sort of the coolest thing, because I suppose a lot of the jobs we do today didn't exist when we were 6 years old, which is quite fun. I suppose that's the benefit of living in the future. When I was 6 years old, I remember seeing in a book that one day people would have watches, phones on their arms, and here we are with Apple Watches completely normally. So I suppose we are living in the future. But no, I wouldn't say it's necessarily what I'd set out to do, but at the same time, I wasn't one of those kids that had a vision for exactly what I wanted to do. I was, I suppose, fortunate in that I was very kind of generally capable and interested in lots of things, very curious, very kind of agnostic. And we did, all sorts of kind of career guidance and counseling sessions. And when we did those, the advice I always got as a teenager, it sort of ranged from everything from, going to finance to going into horticulture. You sort of, well, that's, some some fair extremes there. Where do you end up? So I suppose I'm kind of lucky in that I've ended up in a space where I can be both creative and analytical. And my career has been sort of a pendulum that swings into very creative for a couple of years and then more into analytical. And I'm sort of in a place now where I'm fairly happily kind of in the middle of that. So yeah, definitely I wouldn't say it was where I'd set out to get to, but I think it's probably more interesting than what I would have said when I was 6 years old.
I definitely understand, and I can relate to that. I love having both the creative and the analytical. I need both in my job.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So then, as you were going then through school and such, and as you started developing some passions, where did you start heading?
I hit it very much, I suppose, creative first. And I suppose, as a teenager, you're sort of drawn to, I was drawn to wanting to make things and create things. And, the way I sort of started was a mix of, I was always kind of quite capable technically, and this was in sort of early days of, I suppose, personal computers, lots of, there wasn't a personal computer in everybody's homes. We were fortunate we had, computers from when I was fairly young. So I'd sort of tinker and, experiment. And I remember the first program I wrote in BASIC, and I must have been, I don't know, I must have been about 12, 13, 14. I tried to write a chatbot in BASIC, which in hindsight is obviously pretty funny considering where we are today. But also a little bit embarrassing to think that a 12-year-old back then was going to write a viable chatbot in BASIC. And I remember the conversation flow was obviously as linear as you would expected it to be. But I suppose that kind of tinkering, didn't really lead me into a career in computer science. It sort of just gave me the broad capability to latch onto the sort of desktop video revolution as that kind of really picked up in the late 90s. And so for the first sort of 5-10 years of my career, I very much worked in post-production, in visual effects, in desktop video production. And that then expanded into film production, then into advertising, and sort of slowly and organically got here. But yeah, I think when I was younger, the creative draw was definitely, I suppose, the more interesting side of things, but it was enabled by the technical capability. And I think that's maybe an important thing that when I work with people today is, having that technical ability and grounding has been super useful to allow me to do creative things. It's sort of been an enabler, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the first job?
I actually couldn't quite get a job, so I managed to basically blag my way into a video production company as a runner and a general, IT person and computer fixer and, phone answerer. And out of either pity or guilt, they started paying me after a couple of months. and that's where I eventually became an editor there, and I was there for a couple of years and sort of, I suppose, got my firm grounding there. And this is, like I said, in the late 90s, so everything you learned back then, you learned either through trial and error or by reading manuals. Actually, it was more trial and error than reading manuals, but it was just, what's the word, it was just sort of kind of sheer hard work and just experimentation and going, well, let's take the next path and see if that goes anywhere. Okay, well, that's a dead end, let's try this, let's try, and get somewhere. And I suppose maybe growing up in the early days of gaming and computer games, when it was, King's Quest and Space Quest and those sort of, giving away my age here, but where you basically have to just bash your head against the wall until the wall gives way, was a very good grounding to kind of get that early, kind of career going.
Oh, I love that a lot. So I love that you just picked a company, decided you're going to go after it, and just did whatever it took to get there.
Yeah, look, it's in hindsight, maybe not the most elegant approach, but it worked.
It worked. Yeah. So then you moved. So where did you go from there?
I suppose from there, I got kind of caught into the romance of high-end visual effects, and really, so I grew up in South Africa, and we had a very good film industry in South Africa, but also a very small one. And again, it's sort of a story of how my technical ability, I suppose, helped open doors. It still exists actually. There's a compositing system called Flame, which, back then there were about 2 or 3 of those in South Africa. They were hugely expensive. A day of working within the system, we would essentially rent it out by the day to clients, and the equivalent back then was, I think, in a week's worth of work in the system, you could buy an average family home. That was sort of, the day rate that we would get kind of charged out at. But it was highly, highly technical. So again, my technical ability kind of allowed me to get in there at quite a young age. And that allowed me to then build up the contacts in the creative industries to then start expanding into film production. So I went from there into visual effects. I directed commercials for a while. And then, actually, no, I'm skipping over a step. Before I directed commercials, one of the big changes that we'd seen was, so I was working on the system called Flame, hugely expensive, very, very proprietary, and most projects didn't have the budgets to be able to spend much time in there. And Adobe had just released After Effects. I think it was After Effects version 2 or After Effects version 3, and it was the first version of After Effects that had become viable as an alternative to this very, very high-end system. And you could spend a week in After Effects for the same price as a day in Flame. And, it wasn't a one-to-one relationship in terms of what you could achieve, but the math made sense. So I started a small company that essentially took advantage of this. So did that for a couple of years, eventually exited that, and then went into directing commercials, which I thought was, that was the dream. I wanted to be a commercials director. That was an interesting time. It was a very creative time, but not a great way to pay the bills. So this is my late 20s, so I've always been a big believer that, especially in your 20s, you should try lots of things. And if you're going to make, mistakes and you take wrong turns, your 20s is when you want to do that, because you've got the most room to still course correct as you go. So I suppose, my 20s was a lot of that, trying things that, I thought, that was the dream, photography and being a commercials director. And I had huge amounts of fun doing it, but it just wasn't I didn't have the it just didn't work. I mean, I quite frankly wasn't good enough from a creative perspective, to really make that a career, I don't think. And, you learn some hard lessons as you do that. And kind of out of that, I then, was late 2007, through a contact I'd worked with on and off for a couple of years, he'd had this idea to start a post-production company inside an ad agency. And I was like, well, that sounds like an interesting idea. We'll try that out. And basically that we started back in 2007. And that eventually became a business that we sold to Oliver and now Oliver. And that idea of starting, doing, again, taking advantage of technology, putting that technology into our clients' worlds, again, open doors. And I suppose, I've never kind of told the story in this way, but when you sort of look at that story, it's interesting how the technical ability has unlocked all these sort of doors to do what I really want to do, which is, quite handy.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say so indeed. I love the persistence too, and I love the trial and error. And you're right, I mean, 20s is a great time to try things and fail
Yeah.
and learn and grow. And yeah, so I love that you weren't afraid to do that.
Yeah, and I think, we don't talk, there's lots of, you read often, about how we should embrace failure more. And, I really hope that we do learn that lesson. I mean, it's a very hard lesson when you're in your 20s because, you maybe don't have the perspective yet. Every mistake you make in your 20s feels cataclysmic. How will you ever come back from this? And I suppose, sitting here heading to, the wrong side of 40, you kind of get to look back and go, actually, it's not that cataclysmic. It probably, it probably will work out. And, but I think, that persistence you mentioned, I think, is hugely important. Trying new things is really, really important. And just dusting yourself off and going again. And, that's, even if you don't necessarily know, like I said at the beginning, I never really had a career path in mind, but I had, I have things that give me energy, that feed me, that I find interesting, that I want to explore. And, letting that sort of be the guiding light actually in the long run has worked out really, really well. And it's allowed me to do really interesting things. And in the end, this company that we started in 2007, once that had built up momentum and started getting a bit of scale to it, I actually spent a lot of years being incredibly creative. It allowed me to actually do really, really creative work, really good work, award-winning work. And, if I didn't have that, I suppose, that platform, I probably wouldn't actually have achieved that. So yeah, that persistence is underrated.
Ah, yes, indeed. And congrats on the awards. What awards did you win?
It was interestingly things like craft awards for editing. We won some awards for some AVs we'd created. And we sort of developed a reputation for doing just really compelling, lots of B2B type work, just creating very, very was innovative, a lot of it was, and just compelling work in that space. But we used to joke that we don't need awards, we've got clients. But it's always nice to sort of look back and have that validation is always useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, congrats on that. And so tell me then, being in so how do you currently in your throughout your career, I mean, you talked about generative AI and stuff. How do you use data to make it through your work and with your customers?
Yeah, it's really, it's really interesting. In the early part of my career, data really was content. It was the early days of the desktop kind of revolution in DTP, and then in video, and then other things. So data for us back then was all about how to maximize storage space. Actually, was the biggest issue we had back there. Without how could we get maintain the quality levels that we wanted. While so data was very functional back then to us. It was very much a tool that just allowed us to create the work that we do. And over time, it's sort of gone from content to data driving insight, and now data drives performance for us, in both performance in the effectiveness of the work that we do, but also performance in our organization. So I suppose that's sort of the really great thing about data, is that it's just so many facets to it, that that ability to understand data and work with it, I want to say almost at an abstract level, is incredibly important and incredibly useful, almost ahead of your ability to work at it in a more specific or concrete level as an analyst or as a developer or as a, because what you learn over time, and I suppose having this background of both being creative and analytical, is that there's always pattern to data, and there's always principles to how data performs that actually applies no matter what you do, which I think has been really, really interesting. And, so for us today, one of the challenges we've got is, people used to joke that, in marketing, that 50% of your marketing budget works, you just don't know which 50%. Now, today, we're heading into a world where we actually do understand which 50% is working. So we're getting into a world where we're really starting to optimize every piece of content that we do, every media, dollar that we spend is optimized to really maximize the effectiveness of that spend. So we're getting a really good view on what kind of content performs well in the market, and drives the key metrics. The flip side of that, and this is where AI comes in, is that starts driving towards convergence, because a lot of the measures, are maybe not that sophisticated yet. So once something works, there's a tendency to simply iterate, and maybe you may adjust and iterate, but you tend to iterate, and then slowly you start converging. And the challenge for us now is to create work that we believe will perform, but not conform, if that makes sense. And that's a really challenging kind of mindset for a lot of people to adopt, is a world where, even though the data, says, I don't know, make it magenta for argument's sake, understanding actually the data is not saying make it magenta. There's a message underneath, what currently is coming up as magenta, and understanding how do we carry on differentiating with, from that perspective. So I think data is slightly twee to say, but it's kind of the fuel, right? It's kind of now really the oxygen that drives everything that we do. And I think, I don't know if the marketing services industry, has been slow to, kind of come around to that. But today, compared to even 5 years ago, the amount that we use data, obviously in the effectiveness of the work that we do, like I just said, but also in the transparency of how we do the work. So one of the things for us as an in-house agency, one of our kind of core values is transparency. The benefit of being in our clients' worlds is that we have a deep understanding and empathy for their world, but you earn that empathy and that trust through transparency, which means that we're very, very transparent about our talent utilization, the effectiveness of the work that we do, etc. And that all comes down to tons of data points around how people are spending their time. What are the tools that we're using? Are those the best tools? Are our workflows optimized? And there's a lot of quantitative data that we now work with to also look at how can we optimize our operations to ultimately deliver better value. So data is literally a tool, it's just everywhere. Whereas 20 years ago it was very much a focus on it was what's the word, slightly less romantic. It was really just about optimizing space.
More and more companies are considering investing in data literacy education, but still have questions about its value, purpose, and how to get the ball rolling. Introducing the newest monthly webinar series from DATAVERSITY, Elevating Enterprise Data Literacy, where we discuss the landscape of data literacy and answer your burning questions. Learn more about this new series and register for free at dataversity.net.
Indeed. Yeah. And so how then would you define data? I mean, aside, you mentioned that, it's the oxygen, and it is, but how would you define data as itself?
It's a really interesting question. So one of the big things we've been working on over the last sort of year or two is connecting, I suppose, different bits of data into more meaningful. One of the iterations would be dashboards for us and for our clients to understand how to help see, I suppose, the underlying relationships between things. So I think, how would I define data? It depends so much on through which lens we're looking at it. If we're looking from our customer's lens, that focuses massively on the effectiveness of the work. So, did we move, the cost per acquisition? Did we move the click-throughs? Did we move, the key marketing metrics? And then to support that, what did it cost to move those metrics? So if we moved something by 20%, what was the investment to create that move by 20%? Because at the end, at some point there's a crossover point where actually the investment simply doesn't make sense for the way that we've moved the KPI. So, in our clients' world, it's very much focused on that trade-off between cost and performance. For us internally, it's much more about optimizing the engine that runs it, and that's about maximizing our resources, be that our people, our infrastructure, or our technology. But the way all of this really kind of comes together is, through much more, getting data into people's hands and helping equip them to interpret that data, because that's the other side of this. The data is one thing, but ultimately, as we sit here today, we need people to be able to interpret that data and make it actionable, because the data, without making it actionable, without having a strategic, imperative that it can help us deliver, the data is essentially worthless. I suppose that's maybe, where we're talking about what it means for us is really about figuring out how do we make data actionable, and how do we, that's really, I think, the heart of it today.
Love hearing how much data plays an important role in a creative environment, right?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I wouldn't say it's always easy to, and so, when speaking to you, it's slightly easier to maybe position it as such. I think there's always a tension, and it's a healthy tension between creative and the data, and you need that. I think something that, I suppose, the one thing with data, like I said, being able to interpret data is incredibly important. But I think for this audience, I think we also all know that data can be manipulated, or at least the positioning of, was it lies, damn lies, and statistics, so being very aware that you can't always interpret data at face value. You do need to kind of look, at the underlying metrics. I had a CEO years ago who, when we were going through management reports, he had this complete and allergic reaction to percentages. And he always used to say, if you want to lie, use percentages. Show me the quantum, show me the actual numbers, so I can understand the relationship of the actual of the data, not because the percentage is the narrative we're trying to tell you, and which I thought, has always stuck with me. And I think, as we talk about that tension between creative and data, sometimes a creative's hunch is more powerful than the data would imply, because it can see things, or it can feel things that maybe the data doesn't support today, but in hindsight will support. And I think, my point about convergence earlier, one of the challenges we're starting to see is, we're using analytics tools to help predict the performance of the work that we do. But what's really, really important is to be aware of the fact that it's using past performance to predict likely future performance. And that sort of feeds the convergence loop. And at some point we have to diverge. Otherwise, we will just sort of sink into the sea of sameness. And it comes back to my point about being able to interpret and understand data is really, really important, because as much as we want to give people actionable data, you also have to equip them with the ability to question the data and go, actually, hang on, should I skin this differently? What is the message in there? Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And I think that's common across any industry, right?
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
As what I was saying earlier about kind of patterns in data, and I think one of the beautiful things about it is that when we start looking at data and we compare it across different segments of the business, they tend to perform in similar ways, which is really, really interesting, and outliers are outliers, and anomalies, you can normally spot them fairly easily. Even when when you look at data from finance, or you look at data from marketing performance, there's, like I said, a relationship that you can kind of learn to see, which, I mean, it's, like I said, maybe slightly abstract and what's the word, ethereal for this audience, because we do like data, but I also very firmly believe that when you analyze it, you can sometimes just you can sort of see those patterns that exist there. So yeah, I think it is about trying to just connect those dots. Maybe that's the kind of gist of it.
Yeah, indeed. So tell me, do you see the importance of data and I think I can formulate already
I think
based
we
on a
know
lot
the
of your
answer.
answers already, but but do you see the importance of data management and the number of jobs working with data increasing and decreasing over the next 10 years, and why?
So interesting. And I mean, it's obviously a two-part question. And the first part is it has to increase, right? It has to, the importance of data, I don't see decreasing. The only way in which I see it decreasing is a world where we're relying more on the systems to tell us how to interpret the data. And that's fine. But when you're looking for opportunity and you're looking for those points of divergence that can help you differentiate, the systems may not always be the best place. When I say the systems, looking at things through a very generic lens. So, from my perspective, I would like to think that the number of jobs will increase because data is going to become really, really important. And I think in our industry, one of the big things we're expecting Gen AI to do is create this flood of content because, content creation is becoming very, very accessible. And that means that in turn, differentiation is going to become harder and harder. So finding ways to sort of cut through that kind of noise layer is going to become really important. So within our industry, I would like to believe that, the need for data jobs will increase, and I think it's an interesting thing. I used to say that, I wanted all of our people in our business when we were relatively small back then, there was only a couple of hundred people. I wanted all of them to go on basic analytics and Excel courses so they could at least get a grasp of data and how to interpret it. And this was, creatives and everybody else. And I think the reason for me for that, and I still feel that way today, is that I feel like the ability to interpret and analyze data sits in this little niche over here, and that niche is generally put in a room over there, and it doesn't mix in our business with creative or with strategy and I just think that's such a miss. It's just such a big miss in terms of the real unlock and the real opportunity that the ability to analyze and understand data gives us. But to my earlier point, that only works if we sort of fight against the potential, what's the word, laziness or convenience that analytics tools give us, because analytics tools are incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. You can query Excel in ways now that you just never could 5 and 10 years ago. We had to manually create your queries and your reports, and there's a benefit to that because it's meant that data is now accessible to everybody. But again, that becomes dangerous if people don't understand what that means, how to interpret it, how to use it, because without that, an anomaly can very quickly be, I want to say weaponized. Weaponize your anomalies. There's something in there. Hopefully not weaponizing anomalies. But so I believe that we are going to see an increase in the need for data-related or data knowledge in potentially more generic roles, maybe more so than pure data, jobs increasing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I love that answer, and don't disagree with that. With so many initiatives out there for what's been branded data literacy, right? There's been a lot of controversy over that brand, because the negative of that, if you're not data literate, you're illiterate, which is not necessarily where companies want to go, but or be accused of, but building that awareness and data and knowledge and skills into every job is, you're right, is so important, and something that.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's important. It's important in our jobs, but I think more and more it's also important outside of our jobs. Because what that gives you is the ability to question, the information that you're given. I don't know. Pick a random statistic. I don't know, 300,000 jobs lost in Q1. That's a terrible statistic, but within which context? Globally. Within, the Pacific Northwest, like what, and just stopping and just going, hang on, and as, like I said earlier, we're expecting AI and the ease with which content can be created to obviously drastically increase the amount of content created. It's also going to become an incredibly powerful tool from I don't want to use the word misinformation or propaganda, but the problem is, bad actors will act badly. That's a reality. So the ability to understand the information that you're presented with, interpret it, question it, and look under it is hugely important professionally. But I believe is going to be even more important for us personally to actually go, hang on, this doesn't make sense, and that's how I suppose ultimately, data literacy, like you said, maybe a slightly inflammatory term, but the ability to understand and interpret data is something, quite frankly, we should be teaching kids at school, because it's going to be so important. It is so important. The ability to look through and question and analyze and rationalize what you're being presented with as either real or not real. And it's not a data-related example. Maybe it is a data-related example, but one of the kind of few months ago in the, some generative AI examples of the Pope in a puffer jacket. I'm sure you would have seen those, kind of make their way across social media. And I had the most interesting conversation where, lots of people, thought, what, the Pope in a puffer jacket? That's ridiculous. And I had a client who actually said to me, the thing that caught her eye, and she knows nothing about AI, nothing about technology, the thing that caught her eye was she knew the Pope was in hospital a week ago. Why was he on a beach in a puffer jacket? And that ability, because it's not really a data anecdote, but that ability to connect the dots and see the relationship between those and then go, hang on, this doesn't add up, I think is hugely important. I think data is one of those tools that allows us to do that. If that, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And oh gosh, you're so right. I mean, so much misinformation out there now, right? And with the use of data. I had a friend test out Chat GPT to produce a data science paper.
Yeah.
And went, wow, these are some really great points that they brought up. Great. And asked Chat GPT, what's your sources? And Chat GPT listed a bunch of sources. Well, it turns out when she looked them up, all of the sources were fake.
Yeah. But it does it so convincingly,
right?
It's so confident, and it's so, and it's that, and that's sort of the point for me is I suppose maybe the point of this conversation is that, what we consider data and analytics as an industry and a vocation needs to move. It needs to diffuse into our organizations and into our society. Yes, we still need data scientists, we still need deep specialisms, but at the same time, that general level of understanding has to start diffusing, because that's, I mean, like you said, ChatGPT does hallucinate, and it hallucinates incredibly confidently. And if you don't check your sources, or if you don't question, you will just, go along with it. Yeah.
It's a really cool tool, really fun to use, but check your sources.
Exactly.
So what advice then would you give to people looking to get into career in data?
So it's interesting, and I suppose maybe it's because my background has been so organic and a little bit, I suppose loose is probably the word I would use. And I always say to my staff, very rarely when we're faced with an issue is the issue in front of us the issue. I always say it's the stuff around the stuff, And I suppose my advice to anybody wanting to get into a career in data is probably to try as much as possible and feed both the left and the right, of the brain, and, get that good technical grounding in understanding how to analyze and work with data, and get comfortable with, how, the tools that allow you to pass and analyze and experiment and mess with data almost kind of generically, and, like learning Python, it's like a really good example of just being able to just manipulate things really quickly and just, kind of fiddle around and try things and experiment. But my advice would be to pair that with, something that is probably slightly more on the humanities side and slightly more on the creative side, or something slightly more on the applications or practical side, so that whatever you do, you're able to take that, and bring it, I suppose, more, into the light. And, you look at some of the examples we're seeing with AI in the healthcare industries at the moment. There's a study recently, a 10-second clip having between 86 and 89% accuracy on whether or not, of your voice, sorry, a 10-second clip of your voice having a between 86 and 89% level accuracy on whether or not you have type 2 diabetes. That's amazing.
That is
a
amazing.
10-second recording of your voice can, with 80+% accuracy, tell you if you have type 2 diabetes. And it does that in seconds and for a cost in the cents. The nearest level of accuracy is in the dollars as an alternative to that. And that's sort of my point about having the analytics and the data side, understood and sorted, but figuring out how do you want to try and apply that to the world. And we're seeing these amazing things, like I said, happening in healthcare. I saw another one today, actually, about a tool that now uses your smartphone camera to rate the likelihood of skin lesions being cancerous, and doing that with incredible levels of accuracy. And that only happens when you're able to apply data within a healthcare context, or apply data within another context. Because I think that's maybe my advice would be to figure out what you're passionate about and what you're interested in, and then, I suppose, much like I did, use data and use your technical ability to then help you kind of forge a path through that, because that's I think where you get to do really interesting things, and B, hopefully where you can do really meaningful things.
Oh, that's such great advice. And that is the fun thing about data, right? It's across every industry.
Yeah, it literally, it is everywhere in everything in some way. It's amazing. And drag it, let's get it into, let's get that benefit, into the light. And,
Yeah. Oh, Peter, this has been so much fun. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask, if somebody wanted to find out more about Oliver and solicit your services, how would they do that?
Easiest thing is probably to find us on LinkedIn, or reach out to me, and we'll get the right people in touch. Otherwise, look us up at oliver.agency.
Nice. We'll get those links added to the podcast page as well, so everybody can find those easily. So, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Amazing. I hope there wasn't too much of a roller coaster.
It's great. Great conversation, great information. I love it. And it's very, you work in a very different industry than we've talked to so far. So it's really, really interesting how it's the same kind of, it's universal. Data is universal. So it goes to show, and I really appreciate that. And I love the aspect of blending the creative with the analytical. So thank you.
Amazing. Lovely. Yeah. So nice to chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners out there. If you'd like to keep up to date on the latest podcasts and in the latest in data management education, you may go to dataversity.net/subscribe. Until next time, and stay curious, people. Thank you for listening to DATAVERSITY Talks, a podcast brought to you by DATAVERSITY. Subscribe to our newsletter for podcast updates and information about our free educational webinars at dataversity.net/subscribe.